focusing on health diplomacy and the fight against COVID-19. I'm Noreen Makosere, and I'm going to be your moderator for the duration of this webinar. I'll just go through some quick housekeeping rules just to make it easy for all of us to engage. If you're joining as a delegate and you want to engage in the conversation, for the moment, please switch off all your microphones and your cameras just so that there is no confusion. And also, this call is being recorded, so any sound in the background is going to be picked up, and anything that happens on screen will remain on the internet forever. And as you know, the internet never forgets. We have with us today 5 speakers. 3 main speakers are going to share their thoughts with us for 15 minutes each. And we have 2 plenary guests who are also going to share their opinions for 3 minutes each. We're going to run this conversation for 2 hours from 10 o'clock now until 12 noon. The Q&A is going to be open up to the entire room at 11 o'clock. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers, make sure you jot them down as we're going along. Type them in the chat on the top right-hand side of the screen, of your screen. There's a chat box. Please type your questions in there, and it's going to be picked up by Mary, who's going to be sharing the questions with me, and I'll put them across to the speaker. Please make sure that your question is very clear and very concise, so there's no confusion, and we're making the most of our time. We have one of our guest speakers is going to be with us until until 11:15, Dr. Wala Elizabeth. So please make sure that you have her questions ready by 11 so that we can release her to go on and do what she needs to do for the rest of the day. Thank you so much once again for joining. If you're on Twitter and you want to follow the conversation, the hashtags today are COVIDHD, COVID Health, COVID KE, and Tax Talk 39. Sorry, Tax Talk 39. And you can follow Fiscal Law Africa on Twitter to join the conversation. So you can retweet, you can make comments, and we'd really appreciate the publicity for that. Before we jump into introductions, I'm going to acknowledge all the partners of this webinar. It's been put together by the University of Nairobi. This is a research-intensive university based in Kenya with a reputation for excellence and a strong, vibrant research culture. We also have Oxfam as a partner, a global movement of people working together to end the injustice of poverty. That means that they tackle the inequalities that keep people poor. One of the other partners is Open Society Initiative for East Africa. It was founded as part of the Global Open Society Foundation, and their focus is a just, inclusive, and vibrant East Africa where all people live in dignity, equality, and participate meaningfully in society. Frederick Ebert Stiff Tongue, forgive me for pronouncing it wrong. FES Kenya is a non-profit German foundation. It's funded by the government of the Federal Republic of Germany, and they're committed to the advancement of both socio-political and economic development in the spirit of social democracy through civic education, research, and international cooperation. And finally, we have the International Relations Society of Kenya as a partner as well. It serves as a forum for the exchange of ideas, networking, and programmatic initiatives among those involved in the study, teaching, and the practice of international relations and diplomacy. Once again, thank you for those who have joined us just now. We're going to be discussing health diplomacy and the fight against COVID-19 that we all know is ravaging the world at the moment. We'll move into introductions now, and I'll begin with myself. My name is Noreen Makosere, and I'm the founder of the Radical Leap Company. It's a UK-based management consulting company. Our focus is helping SMEs launch, grow, and expand, and we do that through strategy, technology, and trade diplomacy. Our focus is on the regions of Europe, Middle East, and Africa, and Asia Pacific. And we focus mainly working with key decision makers of organizations, designing strategies to drive growth and increase profitability. I'm also a partner of the Africa Investment Gateway Group, and we focus on connecting the world with investment opportunities in Africa. Our first guest speaker today is Dr. Wala Elizabeth. She has more than 15 years experience spanning the fields of health system strengthening for universal health coverage, healthcare policy development, pharmaceutical medicine, and clinical research. She is very well known and respected for program refinement and building credibility and partnerships across cultures and with leading national and international private, public, and non-profit health sector stakeholders. She has participated in the development of key national and international policies and guidelines across many African countries. Thank you so much for those who are joining. Kindly mute your microphones to interfere with the sound for everyone else. We appreciate it. Dr. Wale Elizabeth has also served as organization representative at national and international forums, conferences, technical working groups, and advisory boards. She's been awarded Top 40 Under 40 Women in 2016, and based on her outstanding contribution to the segment of economy in matters of health in Kenya, inspiring confidence in the fact that the country is really on the path of progress despite the many challenges that it has. Our second guest speaker is Dr. Peter Muencha. He is the Secretary and the CEO of the International Relations Society of Kenya. He has more than 10 years of wide-ranging experience as a lecturer, as a consultant, a researcher, and boasts extensive strategy management and policy-making experience in various sectors as institutional, country, and at institutional, country, and regional level. Dr. Muencha has a BA in International Relations, an MBA in Marketing Management, and a PhD in Business Administration with particular focus on marketing management. He is also a member of the Marketing Society of Kenya, MSK, and he sits on a number of boards in the country. Our third guest speaker is Joyce Kibbett. Joyce is a council member of the International Relations Society of Kenya and has over 10 years experience as a business and social innovation consultant, with a strength in helping businesses indigenous to Africa demystify business strategy, adopt systemic thinking, and own sustainable impact. She sits in advisory boards and is currently the national head of economic and trade pillar of the Regional Women Forum of the International Conference of the Great Lakes Region, ICGLR. She has a bachelor's degree in international business administration and professional development certificates in inclusive business from the World Bank and in negotiating social impact investment from Strathmore University. Our third guest speaker today is Joel Okamba. He's an intellectual and practitioner of diplomacy with over 5 years experience focused on enhancing peace and security agenda through a multi-sectoral approach and research. He has engaged with multiple sectors in developing key partnerships that will sustainably and innovatively enhance the diplomatic ecosystem. In his work, he has engaged with governments, international organizations, intergovernmental organizations, the UN agencies, private sector, NGOs, and academic institutions. He's a founding member of the Center for International and Security Affairs, CISA, and a graduate from the University of Nairobi's Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies. He holds a bachelor's degree in international studies. Finally, our other speaker is Hazel Birungi, a feminist lawyer working with an organization called Akina Mama wa Africa as the Feminist and Transformational Leadership Associate. She is passionate about women, tax justice, women economic justice, and financial inclusion as a driver for sustainable development. Thank you everyone once again for joining us today. And just in case you've joined us, I'll just quickly run through housekeeping rules to make sure that we all engage effectively today. As you join, please mute your microphone and switch off your camera. Our speakers are going to share their insights with us for 15 minutes each. The first 3 speakers I'm going to introduce, and then the last 2 speakers will share their insights for 3 minutes. The floor will be open for Q&A at 11 o'clock, so please type your questions in the chat on the top right-hand side of your screen. There's a chat box. Make sure you include the name of the speaker you want to address, and we're going to direct the questions accordingly. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Elizabeth Wala. The floor is open to you.
Thank you very much. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Okay, thank you. It's a pleasure to be invited to this forum. Uh, I will speak to the health side of COVID-19, looking at health systems, just taking through what are the pillars, because this is important in understanding the kind of measures, mitigation measures that we put in place as uh, as healthcare workers. But first, to just introduce the virus, because it's a unique virus. It's novel in the human population. COVID-19, coronavirus is much more common in birds. So science has it that the origin is from Wuhan, which is a market area in China, and that it has jumped from a population of animals, in this case the birds, to human beings. So this is the important background, because as we are tackling it, we need to to include the veterinary surgeons, because it is a One Health approach. Now, when it comes to the kind of spread, so WHO has certain measures that they use to classify a disease as a pandemic. So often it is an epidemic where you find the cases moving from one person to several people. So we use epidemiology, which is a study of how disease spreads, in order to classify the extent of the nature of the disease. And therefore, this year, WHO classified the disease as a pandemic because it has crossed very many borders. Sorry, I live near an airport. It had crossed many borders, and thus, when the declaration goes to a pandemic state, there are certain triggers that are affected both by the World Health Organization, but also countries all over. So you can imagine that the first case was, the diagnosis of the first case, at least on record, was the last quarter of last year. But everyone was on alert. I will give you our system as we are structured here. We have the Ministry of Health, which has a Department of Disease Surveillance and Response. So this department is tasked with the responsibility of getting to follow up on diseases of an infectious nature. And so when these global events are happening, then they are supposed to start preparing mitigation measures to find out how we are able to protect ourselves as a country. Another thing I need to make you understand is with globalization, diseases do not respect borders. We've seen it with the Ebola, with the SARS, with swine flu, where infection starts with the locus of infection is quite far off, but because we have our borders open towards trade, towards air traffic, and any other cross-border transport, we do have cases of infections crossing this. So we're with regards to the diplomacy around managing this, it's not just a health issue. As I'd mentioned, it is a zoonotic infection, meaning that it is a disease that is seen, an infection that is seen in animals, but has now crossed over to the human population. Therefore, the approach needs to involve the animal health specialists. Then also locally, when you look at the ministries that are involved, because it is a global event, we are talking about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which normally one would not think twice about involving in health issues, except now we have, say, citizens in some of these countries who need to be repatriated or whose health is an issue or is a responsibility of the countries where they come from. So Ministry of Foreign Affairs is very important. The other thing is that they are also tasked with any population or any foreign citizens coming into the country, and they need to be involved. The other one is the Ministry of Trade, and for us it's trade and finance, trade and industrialization, because the mitigations that have been put in place, for example, closing of the borders, has a direct impact on cross-border trade that is happening. The other one is Ministry of Internal Security. One is that some of the mitigation measures that we are taking into force, for example, the social distancing we had recently of Isili yesterday being under lockdown, there is a definite threat of civil unrest because you are now requiring citizens to take certain measures which they may not comply with. So there is an aspect of Ministry of Internal Security getting involved in with regards to just maintaining law and order. And finally, but not least, is the Ministry of Health itself, which is at the core of the pandemic fight. Then when you look at the governance structures, globally as a Ministry of Health or the stakeholders in health, we respond to the World Health Organization. So World Health Organization is the global body to which we have subscribed as a country that is tasked with advising on any health issues within the world. So whatever measures that World Health Organization issues are what we trickle down and adapt accordingly. But we've seen that there are countries that have not followed it. I think Tanzania is a clear example that has decided, you know what, we're going to do it our way. And that comes with pros and cons. And I think someone will speak to that. Now, coming straight down, we have the Afro region of WHO, which now is looking at African countries. And then as a country, we are part of the African community. So the East African community comes with treaties, comes with regulations. For example, in the health sector, one of the regulations that has been passed is that any health provider is able to practice in any of the East African communities without requiring to register afresh in those communities. So these kind of treaties are important to understand because if, for example, the fight would require human resources of a certain type that one country doesn't have, but another country could provide, then it's easy because the regulations are already in place. And then we trickle now down to the governments, which are responsible for the health of the population. I think our constitution has that clearly laid out what the roles of the government are towards protecting, towards offering the highest possible care to institutions. Finally, just talking about health systems, because when we are approaching issues or situations in the health space, we have about 6 or 7 years that are supposed to be strengthened or built in terms of capacity in order to resolve an issue. In this case, these are the people working either from the front line or at the back, ranging from scientists, ranging from people working in health facilities, policy makers, community health volunteers. Basic that is this. Now, if I speak to our population, to our situation in Kenya, we have a massive shortage of human resources for health on all fronts. WHO has dictated a minimum standard required for the number of doctors, say, to the number of the population, or the number of nurses to the population. And we are short in terms of numbers, absolute numbers, but also in terms of skill sets. If you look at COVID-19, there is a requirement, or there is if you're anticipating that you'll have people admitted in ICU facilities, we have very few ICU specialist nurses or ICU specialist doctors. So it is, we need to look at the capacity as a country to tackle this. And then if you look at the second pillar, which is commodities or supply chain. So we have looked at the global trade. We've seen America hoarding supplies that are manufactured in America, and this has drastically affected our testing capabilities. So we have machines that are able to do tests for COVID-19, but the cartridges for those machines are mostly manufactured in the US. And President Trump has said, I'm not giving out these things. So it is important to understand the diplomacy issues, because at some point you need government to government intervention. For example, our government, I have made aware, has had conversation with the Chinese government to try and bring in personal protective equipment or other equipment that are required towards the fight of COVID-19, and to bring them at a lower, at a price that is affordable, because now the market is crazy. We as health workers or other stakeholders in the health space are unable to predict the prices or the cost of treating a patient, because today the gloves will cost this amount, tomorrow it will be 10 times that. Since we are in a free trade space where our markets are not regulated, or we don't have fixed retail prices, then anyone is able to pick or to put a price to whatever item that they are bringing in at whatever cost. The other pillar that we look at is information systems. Hello, am I still there?
Yes, hi, Dr. Elizabeth, we can hear you. If you're not a speaker, thank you for those who joined. If you're not a speaker, kindly switch off your camera for us, just to make it easy for us to engage. Your camera and your microphone. Dr. Elizabeth, you may continue.
I'm so sorry. So I was
Okay.
talking about the price issue just before I think that went off. And this is regulated by international forces, and we have seen that the government to government diplomacy can help to reduce the cost of some of these products that we have to bring into the country. We also have seen a factor of local production, local manufacturing, and as such, we need raw materials that may not necessarily be found in the country. So cross-border trade for raw materials in order to boost up local production of our personal protective equipment or any other supplies or machines required for the fight of COVID-19 has to involve diplomacy at that level. Then we have information systems. That's our third pillar. Information systems, one is very crucial in this space, in the space of social distancing. So we've had facilities shutting down quote unquote, non-essential services. People are being told to go to telehealth kind of medicine. We also need ICT in terms of networking, in terms of data provision, to be able to share this information at a global space. There's a talk of shadow reports from countries that are not necessarily very free with their data and information. And that brings in issues, because if you're not sharing the information, and I think we've seen reports of where people are talking about China not revealing the actual data that they have, or things to do with Tanzania, which is our neighbor, that, there's shadow reports from other sources of media that is saying, what the government is saying is not what is actually on the ground. So in this space of ICT information, technology, it's important that we are linked globally, because all this data contributes towards certain decisions being made at a global level. We have a fourth pillar called service delivery, and service delivery is looking at the type of services being offered. I have already mentioned that in the fight to COVID-19, we need to prepare ourselves for possible scale up of our critical care services. And when you look at this, we are short on human resources, we are short on the skills itself, and we are short on supply chain. And then the other pillar is healthcare financing, which is the money that is used to fund all the response. We do have money coming in from World Bank, and this is a loan. It is not a grant. So it's very important that we appreciate as a country the choices being made globally. We do have events, or rather situations, where the private sector especially has put pressure on the government to try and get treaties, or to try and get basically reorganizing the loans that we have taken as a country, because this is having an impact in how we are not collecting taxes because of this, the economy going down or the lockdown situation, and thus we are not able to pay out our debts. So there is that diplomacy that will be involved, in which a country is looking at how do we either reduce the amount of loan that we have out there, or how do we mitigate even locally, internally for our population. And then second last is on leadership and governance. So this is about who takes the lead? What is the command center? So we saw initially as a country there was no lead. I mean, the leadership was all over the place until the president instituted the National Response Center, Emergency Response Center, and therein now we put in structures on who is responsible for whichever sector. So this is important because it also feeds to the global response units, because now there's a clear chain of command, and this trickles down right to the what kind of mitigation we have. Finally, the last pillar is on research and development. And in research and development, we are talking about
I believe there's probably a technical issue with Dr. Walla's system. Are we able to retrieve it? Well, we thank Dr. Walla in her absence for the issue back on. She's back on. So just wrap up in 1 minute that last part, because we missed what you said because the screen went dead. So the last
part is on research and development.
Okay, these are the joys of technology. Please forgive the system for failing us. But we'll come back to Dr. Walla's research and development point later on. Please, if you have any Q&As for Dr. Elizabeth, type them in the chat. Mary's going to collate them and we'll share them when we open up the floor for Q&A. So thank you, Dr. Elizabeth, for sharing your insights with us and your thoughts. And very insightful information there about shortage of human resources in Kenya. The focus of this webinar is health diplomacy and the fight against COVID-19 on the continent of Africa, and we're paying particular focus to Kenya. And the statistics that Dr. Elizabeth shared with us is focusing on Kenya. So if you have any questions, we'll take them during the Q&A. I'm going to introduce the next speaker for the day is Dr. Peter Muencha. He is the Secretary and CEO of the International Relations Society of Kenya. Dr. Muencha, the floor is open to you
now. Thank you, Noreen. Morning, everyone. Thank you for being part of this interesting dialogue and conversation around an interesting topic and topical issue in our country right now. Let me first say I'm not a public health person, so the presentation by Dr. Walla has been quite informative. And just to give a backdrop of what health diplomacy is, a background and more, so that I can then situate this in the Kenyan context, there's a presentation that we are going to run for about 6 minutes on by the WHO on global health diplomacy. So kindly bear with us. Let's listen in on the presentation, and then after that, I'll do my presentation. Thanks. So thank you very much, Mary, for that presentation. As you've seen in the presentation, in the short video, health is now a key priority even in diplomatic fora. And this is something that maybe is becoming more clear to us in recent times, but because of the COVID pandemic. But the issues of health or infectious diseases, for that matter, have always been at the forefront of bodies such as the WHO and other regional bodies such as the African Union and others. I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Misiani, we can hear you. Please go on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Noreen. So yes, so historically, health has not been at the forefront of national priorities. And this is because maybe it's a technical issue and many of us are not conversant with the technical issues involved in healthcare or public health for that matter. But with the increase in infectious diseases as a result of globalization, national policymakers are now realizing that they need to pay more attention to healthcare, and they're recognizing the impacts of health crisis may have on national interest. So coming from a foreign policy perspective background, you could tell that discussions are centered more around what we call hard issues, security, trade, and others, and health has been a peripheral issue. But then now, as the threat of pandemics is emerging, and given what you're experiencing now with COVID, implications for foreign policy and the implications of healthcare for diplomacy is now being taken very seriously because of national security interests. This means that as diplomats or as people who are interested in foreign policy issues, we need to know and need to recognize the intrinsic and instrumental value of health to promote economic development and fair distribution of economic development. You can see what's happening now. Nobody's going to work. Economic activity has ground to a halt. And this therefore shows that if you don't take healthcare seriously or public health seriously, then even the economic development that you're seeking to promote will ground to a halt. And as many politicians or leaders have mentioned, we are fighting an invisible enemy that you can't see. So the national security implications of healthcare are now very different from the conventional security approach or framework that we are used to, or that dominates the foreign policy discussions. So healthcare is and has always been fundamental aspect of ensuring human security and the nation's security of nations and the globe as a whole, and we therefore and also human rights, and we therefore need to discuss this, or we need to take this into consideration when we in our foreign policy and our diplomatic initiatives. So because of the way healthcare has been treated, you see that investment has been lagging behind. Dr. Wala mentioned the gaps in our healthcare system, and I'm just going to emphasize that if we had any doubts about the need to invest in health, then COVID has shown that this is not, we don't have a choice, and we need to find money or resources to invest in. And you can see the challenge we're having as a country when it comes to testing, diagnostic kits, laboratories, personal protective equipment. So these are things that now, even beyond foreign policy or health diplomacy, these are issues now at even at a personal level that even us as individuals we have been forced to consider. So you can see the challenges, the complex issues that have been brought about by this pandemic, and we therefore, and this is why this topic is very important. So the foreign policy nexus, healthcare foreign policy nexus, is basically as a result of the fact that infectious disease does not respect or recognize national borders. And therefore, as countries as states, as regions, when at something like this, when these pandemics or epidemics come up, countries need to scramble and move quickly to, either mitigate or prevent these diseases from spreading. So what we are seeing because of this is one of the, I think, a lifetime, the first pandemic that really has hit home here in Kenya. There's now more attention and interest in healthcare issues, not just at a national level, but also at a regional and international levels. And for us in foreign policy, we are now looking at this as an issue of shared sovereignty, because now no one country can, address this thing on their own, this pandemic, and we therefore need to work together. And there's going to be negotiations and concessions that have to be made for this, for us to be effective, to fight this effectively. Now, I think this was evidenced by the fact that recently there was a call there was a conference called by presidents, a number of presidents in Africa who are looking at how to address healthcare and the epidemics and this pandemic from a regional perspective. This was AU teleconference, and I think our president was one of those who participated in it. And the heads of the other regional economic blocs, the RECs, as we call them. And yeah, and you can see now, even at a regional level, as Africa, we're now trying to see how to work together to address these issues. And therefore, for me, what what has struck me is that the issue of interstate relations now is more important than ever, because countries need now to be really working closely together, and diplomacy now plays a role in how these issues are coordinated, because if you're not able to coordinate responses across country or across a region, then this is going to be very difficult to control this pandemic. And therefore, this issue of fighting COVID or mitigating the impact of COVID is no longer now a domain of, let's say, health experts alone, or doctors, or it's now becoming an issue of everyone has to be part of this, and that's where diplomacy comes in and provides the guiding principles of how this framework or this coordination will be organized. So there's a lot of coordination that is needed to fight the disease and also to prevent it from re-emerging. There's countries that have already been able to. China has already, is now reopening carefully. But then despite that, you've seen the issues with Africans being mistreated in China because they're being accused of spreading the disease, or they're the ones who are they're being suspected of being, infected with the disease. So this means that even on a global level, even as countries look to have fought the disease, there's also a risk of re-emerging, and therefore the coordination that you need and the collaboration that is needed by countries is very, very important. And therefore we cannot be we cannot relax and say that everything is in order, or countries are now safe, or one country is safe, and then you think that you'll be safe, you'll also be spared from the pandemic. So there's need for collaboration. So for me, for us as Kenyans, we need to learn from what other countries are doing. So China provides a model. There's a lot of debate. I don't want to go into the issues. There's a lot that has been done by China to fight the disease, some of which you can pick up, including the issues of technology. How do we use technology to fight the disease? I've seen some interesting apps, contact tracing, and also how do you build health systems? What has been in place before, such that has helped China to fight the disease. So, but on a policy level, leave alone technology, on a policy level, what we've seen in other countries that have been prepared, the level of preparedness is for instance, the US, at least before this administration, the US, from a diplomatic perspective, has spent a lot of, has built in a system or a framework or resources to fight this. So, and you have at the Department of State level in the US, they have what you call the Office of Global Health Diplomacy. And this is an ambassador level office who coordinates global health issues and reports to the Secretary of State. So just looking at the US, this is something that from a preparedness perspective, they've already put in place. And what would Kenya learn from this, or what would Africa or other countries learn from this when it comes to looking at how the level at which global health diplomacy is addressed? So, but this is not, when you look at Kenya's foreign policy, what comes out is that health is not a priority. I was looking at it some time back as I was preparing my presentation today, and I didn't see anything that mentions health, because we first developed a foreign policy in 2014. Since independence, our first written foreign policy was published in 2014. And when you look at it, you realize that it is left out health issues. So clearly there's a gap in terms of where we've placed health diplomacy in our foreign policy, because as if you look at the documents, our foreign policy is anchored on 5 pillars. And these are peace diplomacy, economic diplomacy, diaspora diplomacy, environmental diplomacy, and cultural diplomacy. So you can see the gap already from a foreign policy perspective. And therefore, this COVID pandemic just shows us that there's more work that needs to be done, or there's more, we need to revisit our foreign policy and situate health in the foreign policy space.
Thank you
so that's one of the issues.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. Those are very, very very poignant points that we need to consider. One, as a continent, and two, as a country. We will come back to you during the Q&A session. And we'll move over to Joyce Kibbett, who's going to speak for about 10 minutes. I'm conscious that Dr. Wala will be leaving us, and there are questions that are coming through for each of the speakers, Dr. Muencha, Dr. Wala, and I'll be posing them to you during the Q&A session, and then we can expound some more on those really important points. Thank you so much, Dr. Peter Muencha. Our third speaker for today is Joyce Kibbett. Joyce is a council member of the International Relations Society of Kenya, and she's worked for over 10 years, has extensive experience in business and social innovation consulting, and she'll be sharing her insights with us. Joyce, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Noreen, and good morning or good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm aware that maybe there could be those that are joining us from different parts of the continent and the globe. Can you hear me, Noreen?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Okay. And thank you so much even to the speakers who have set both a national perspective and Dr. Muencha, who had set the broad perspective on health diplomacy. A few people have asked me, what is health diplomacy? Because I'm sure, like Dr. Muencha was saying, that this is something that Kenya has not been able to highlight as a need in our foreign policy, and hence the questions even to different practitioners who are in the field of health. So thank you once again. I'll read out what the presentation, and because it's out to a written speech. My perspective will be on how commercial diplomacy will be intersecting with health diplomacy, because it goes without saying it's not just the health sector that has been affected in Kenya and in the continent and in the globe, but economies have been affected, and health attachés will play a very, very key role in fighting COVID-19 implications in the country, in the continent, and in the globe. Now, my context will be commercial diplomacy, and we should also look at how this will be played out, especially with the continental market that is about to come in place. And so kindly allow me to look at a different screen and read this through. And the COVID-19 pandemic has presented Kenya and Africa with an overlap of a number of health and economic, social, and political disruptions, which have rapidly moved beyond county and national borders. Consequently, this has placed a rapidly escalating demand for a new construct for national policy and foreign policy, which includes but is not limited to national and intra-Africa cooperation. It goes without saying that health security has now become and will continue to be the primary driver in all diplomatic dialogues across the board, including commercial diplomacy dialogues. Kenya and Africa's fight against the implications of the COVID-19 pandemic will have to sustain the participation of multi-sector and multilateral stakeholders with the objective of actualizing both measurable gains and learning points during what is now presumed to be a health marathon towards the vaccine and other related interventions. From a diplomacy context, it can be argued that health diplomacy has quickly become a fundamental cross-cutting diplomatic catalyst in Kenya, Africa, and the globe. The recent evidence of this is the announcement of the postponement of the economic bloc by the Secretary General of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, Mr. Wamkele Mene. The Secretary General cited that this decision was influenced largely by the very clear change in the momentary trajectory by the member states from economic and trade development to national and continental health security. In addition to this, a second intra-African trade fair, which was scheduled to take place from 1st to 7th September 2020 in Kigali, Rwanda, has also been postponed for 1 year due to the COVID-19 pandemic. With reference to this, therefore, allow me to set a backdrop of the implications of health diplomacy on commercial diplomacy and its impact on the COVID-19 fight in Kenya and Africa. Once implemented, the continental economic bloc is estimated to be the fertile ground to the world's market, will generate about $4 trillion from investment and intra-African trade. AFCTA is being lauded as the Africanness of industries and enterprises in member states, enlarging the opportunities for economies of scale improvements and enhancing the capabilities of national and continental resource allocation. The anticipated positive trickle-down effect to private sector, both in the formal and informal sector, is projected to be access to cheaper raw materials, spurring of the growth of national and continental value chains, increased job creation, as well as propelling the adoption of supporting technology for business and social ecosystem. African commercial diplomacy practitioners from each member state are already poised to act as the negotiators and foreign trade policy commercial attachés when the Pan-African market is commenced, and they'll place an active focus on the development of business-to-business cooperations between the business communities of the member states. The aim will be to embed sustainable commercial gains for their own countries in the form of inward and outward trade and investment through the means of intra-Africa business and entrepreneurship promotion, as well as improved trade facilitation activities. Kenya's and Africa's trade has for a very long time been plagued by non-tariff barriers and soft periodic protectionism, as well as the hue and cry from private sector and investors with regards to the very slow elimination of these non-tariff barriers. It is my belief that the COVID-19 pandemic has added to the existing non-tariff barriers and may also in turn spur protectionism from the member states. An example of these non-tariff barriers and seeming trade protectionism are the added COVID-19 related health safety constraints to cross-border trade being experienced by transport and logistics companies in East Africa with regards to the limitation of movement of their truck drivers. Many logistics businesses have cited the consequent commercial strain due to the COVID-19 health safety regulations. We can expect that these and other emerging cross-border trade, COVID-19 related health safety regulations are bound to be developed into foreign trade policy in Kenya and in Africa in the coming days. In anticipation of this, therefore, it will be paramount for commercial diplomacy practitioners to collaborate with health diplomacy practitioners so as to begin to develop a sustainable and proactive framework which will be able to assess and interrogate the current and projected nature of health safety non-tariff barriers, the social, economic, political impact on commercial activities, the modeling of new trade cooperation between Kenya and African member states, as well as the overall influence of these health safety non-tariff barriers on foreign policy architecture. Hand in hand with this is the ensuing rise of cost of doing national and cross-border trade business in Kenya and Africa. A majority of Kenyan and African cross-border traders are women whose majority profit share is injected back into domestic activity and the remaining portion is followed back into their business. The restriction of movement due to the COVID-19 pandemic has already totally decimated some women-led businesses or placed some in conditions of passive business survival activity. The foreseen added monetary costs rising from health safety non-tariff barriers and health safety policy and regulations for business and cross-border trade has further and will continue to place a monetary and non-monetary strain on women-led businesses in Kenya and Africa. Current forecasts show overall global investor confidence has fallen sharply due to the multiple and overlapping adverse implications given fruit by the COVID-19 pandemic. Women-led businesses were already marginalized with regards to access to capital as well as access to information, which if they had, they would use to leverage for strategic decision-making. As a result of this, therefore, commercial diplomats who are inclined towards women-led businesses will have to work very closely with health diplomats to craft innovative partnerships and cooperations between investors and women in business. Commercial diplomats will have to recognize that investors will now have to consider health safety policies and pandemic risk mitigation as core indicators of commercial and trade diplomacy negotiations. Therefore, in order for Kenya and Africa to continue to successfully fight the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, it will also be important to design gender mainstreaming trade facilitation mechanisms which are critically informed and undergirded by health foreign policy decisions. In addition to this, we can all agree that keeping national borders open, mitigating the disruption of national, regional, and interregional trade and economic activities has summoned many policymakers to the table with an objective of rethinking, repositioning, and redistributing many services and resources, including national social protection funds. Inclusive COVID-19 recovery strategies in Kenya, the region, and the continent will now have to include national social protection policies that have integrated resources and interventions for pandemic disruptions. Currently, national social protection funds primarily consist of policies that help to temper with citizens' vulnerabilities and risks due to disabilities and old age. The innovation of social protection policies set up as public-private partnerships and coordinated by health attachés will remain a key variable in the design of inclusive national COVID-19 recovery interventions. Health diplomacy will play a key role at the decision-making table as governments and private sector rethink, renegotiate, and remodel the social protection policies and resources. It goes without saying that the collective impact of innovating national social protection policies among African member states will have a vertical and horizontal cushioning impact in the continental economy. As a result, it is foreseeable that continental diplomatic dialogues are bound to insist that all member states renegotiate economic agreements based on the measure of pandemic disruption resilience or social protection policies within each member state. Health attachés will therefore play a key role in helping to design pandemic resilience measurements for social protection policies in an effort to help member states to commence and conclude trade policy negotiations. In conclusion, it will be important to note that the traditional practice of health diplomacy is quickly evolving into a practice and profession that will be necessary for Kenya and Africa to successfully navigate and surmount the challenges that have been presented by the COVID-19 pandemic. The country and continent will need to identify and adequately train health diplomacy practitioners who will be able to understand and negotiate a myriad of health safety-related foreign policy situations, such as movement of persons, pandemic resilience trade policy agreements, among others. The country and continent will also have to design a leak-proof human resource pipeline in order to retain the health diplomats who will not only have the academic and professional competencies, but will have added knowledge of Kenyan and African nuances that are crucial bridging tools during negotiations and foreign policy interventions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joyce. That was a fully loaded speech. Thank you very much. You've covered some very interesting points, especially around trade, investment, around engaging cross-border engagements, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and be interesting to see what questions come through. If anybody's interested in Joyce's speech write-up, she has it available, and you can always request it via the chat room, and it will be made available via the university. Thank you so much, Joyce, for sharing your very valuable insights with us. So we'll move quickly to get the insights of Joel Okamba and Hazel Birungi. Joel is an intellectual practitioner of diplomacy with over 5 years experience. Joel, thank you so much for joining us. Could you just take 3 minutes to share with us your thoughts on this very important topic of health diplomacy and the fight against COVID-19, looking at Africa, but also looking at the context of Kenya in particular?
Thank you, Noreen. I hope I will make sure that I observe the timing. So first of all, to thank the speakers who have been there before. I think they've given a good understanding of where we are right now. Probably just to add a little is that 200 years ago, at such a year, this is 1820, the world was dealing with the cholera pandemic just as we are today. And it was spread through the same means that at least we have learned over time, for instance, travel. And at the time, it spread from India in Bengal through China, through Russia, and into Eastern Europe, and then into Western Europe. And then we had about 6 other cycles, repetitive cycles of the cholera pandemic, which cost a lot of lives. But we have learned over time, and today we're trying as much as possible to limit travel, and that has been observed by all countries and by all airlines, despite the losses that such an industry is making, and also related industry as well. Probably I would want to also look at it from a theoretical perspective, and this is coming from security theories. And what we're seeing today is the Copenhagen school of theory coming to play, where both the wideners and deepeners school of thought, which led to expansion of what could be security. And right now, we are seeing that at least diplomacy since the 1850s focused on economic and trade. And then for the last part, I think over about 2 decades, 3 or 2 decades ago, we were focusing on environmental issues. And now we're beginning the 21st century looking at health issues. And I think this is a new precedent that will take shape, probably now looking at various interactions between the players, and perhaps now a time to look at what the theorists call the comprehensive security framework, which just doesn't bring together the players within the health sector, but also brings in other players who can support the process. And for instance, what we're seeing right now is an appeal, for instance, by the UN of 4.7 billion to be able to deal with this crisis in support of WHO and the UN agencies. The African CDC, through the special envoy on COVID-19, has also made the appeal. And so various countries are also making the appeal. We saw recently the Kenyan government launching an M-Pesa pay bill number through the partnership with Absa Bank. So again, we're seeing a lot of collaborations between unlikely partners taking shape and within the continent. From a practical point of view, when we're discussing the diplomacy of health, this is something that was started, I think, in reference, just to be very exact, it was in 1851, where we had the first international sanitary conference, bringing states together to discuss the cholera, the plague, the yellow fever. And since then, discussions have shaped and up to the formation of the WHO. And now in Africa, where we have the leading agency, which is the Africa CDC, collaborating with the regional players and also the national public health institutes. So the operationalization of the health diplomacy has been trickling down, and that's a good thing. So we're not really at a bad place in terms of structures that can deal with this. In terms of the response, I think so far we can say there's been a lot of efforts, including from the African Union, to bring as much players as possible. Last week, I was in a meeting where the head of political affairs of the AU was making a presentation, and he was speaking in the lines of that we just don't look at the health pandemic in its individual form, but see how this affects other areas for instance, how this then affects areas of peace and security. Because terrorists are not sleeping, they're not observing social distancing, and so if we miss out this, then we might have to relook at other crises that could unfold later. I spoke of, for instance, the effect this is having on the recently signed the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and the setup of the institution and the international legal framework that was supposed to support the Free Continental Agreement, which some of those things at this point have been affected, which again, the other effect which leads to a development crisis. There was the Vision Africa 2063, which then again we must relook and look at what aspects do we need to revise amidst this crisis. And all of these institutions are currently setting up research and think tanks to kind of like show a way forward and provide guidance to this government. So no one really is an expert in this. So we're all observing, but we're all trying also to just be as real as possible. For Kenya, I am part of a multisectoral group where the UN, some governments, the Kenyan government, private sector foundations and philanthropy within the country are really, they meet once every week to discuss the progress. And we're seeing the support towards government coming in very handy. There's been lots of contributions to the tune of 1.3 billion for the Kenyan government from the appeals made. This is outside of the Kenyan government's budget. There are concerns, of course, as regards to the medium-term and long-term view of the approaches we're taking right now. For instance, are we looking at food security issue after this, because then it's affecting farming. For trade specifically, I think the government has been realistic on this, and trade has not really much been affected of products. We're seeing imports and exports still going on, whether it's health equipment, whether it's food. And so we are still kind of like in safe waters at this point, not really in a very, very bad place.
Thank you so much, Joel. I'll come back to your points. You're covering some very key points, especially around security. Excuse me. Around security, you mentioned very aptly that terrorists are not asleep at this time and they're not observing the things that we're observing. So we'll come back to your points. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to make sure that we grab Dr. Elizabeth Walla before she jumps off the call. Our final speaker is going to be Hazel Birungi. She'll take about 3 minutes to share her thoughts. But before we go to Hazel, I want to come back to Dr. Walla before you leave us. There's some key questions that have come through for you. And if you can unmute your microphone and come back on camera, I'll just read out the questions that have come through. One of the delegates has asked, it's good we're talking about health diplomacy, and we have seen a global response to the fight against the virus. What would be your recommendation for a country like Tanzania, a country not just ignoring WHO guidelines, but not taking the virus seriously? That's one question. And then the next question is, in your opinion, in mainstream health diplomacy in the midst of this pandemic, who should lead and set the pace and guidance for technical duel with the virus? Do we need a specialist taking the front? So Dr. Elizabeth, if you could just take those questions for us. I know you'll be leaving us in about 5 minutes. If you can unmute your microphone, and let's just have your thoughts on this. Thank you, Joel. We'll come back to you in the Q&A session. We can't hear you, Dr. Elizabeth. Kindly unmute you. We can see you, but we cannot hear you. So. No, we cannot hear you. I know technology can fail us sometimes. Do you want to take off your headset just in case? Maybe it's the issue.
Is that better? Can
That
you
is
hear me?
better. We can hear you now. Yes, thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry about that. So with
No.
regards to Tanzania, I think it's an interesting approach that I've taken. I don't know whether it's in regards to also the kind of background they come from, which is more of a socialist state. So it will be interesting to see how that goes. The only issue I have, because every country has a right to take the kind of measures that they do. And what we are really worried about is that the scientific community is not being given a voice. Because the political leadership may speak whatever they want to speak, but I would expect something different from the scientific community, because they are the ones who are using epidemiology and data in terms of that. So I think it's just a point where we are watching and waiting. Unfortunately, the effects may be catastrophic if it's not observed. So I would want to see how the East African community as a whole will respond to it, and also the WHO Afro region. But the most they can do is generally advice. Now, in terms of who to lead for the front, I think it's not about who's at the head. It is about the team that's on the table. So the team that's on the table should include social scientists, should include the epidemiologists, should include the health people, trade, security. So it should be a multi-sectoral team with leadership. I think based on different countries' approach in our leadership, it's the health sector that has been picked to lead it. But I know on the table is a team of various sectors. So I would answer that question in that way, that it's not about who's leading, but it's about who's on the table under that leadership. Thank you.
Okay, there is another question that came through for you, Dr. Elizabeth, is how should we wear the masks? I see Kenyans and every leader handing masks below their chins when addressing the public. Is this a wrong way? Then says it's sensitization. Is sensitization a necessity for the government and leadership as well?
Yeah, unfortunately, people have maybe not owned the purpose. So this is why we need social scientists on the table, because we need people to first understand why they need to wear masks, and then they own the process of wearing masks. For now, people are wearing because if you don't, you will be, it's a criminal offense, it's a civil offense, and thus it is more for the show. But generally, the aspect of wearing masks is to prevent contamination of droplets from on your nose and mouth, which is the entry point for most of the virus. But we know that it can also enter through the eyes, and also from people from touching, their hands on surfaces that may be contaminated, and then back to their hands and noses. So once people understand the principle and the reason why they need to put on masks, then they start owning it from an understanding point and not from a criminalization or victimization point of view. Thank you. And I think my biggest issue is actually the disposal. We are seeing a lot of worrying trends in the management of the environmental disposal of these masks, because they pose a risk towards anyone who's handling this or even contaminating the environment. Thank you.
So obviously the environmental issue is not, I haven't heard anybody mention it yet, but obviously I think it's a topic that would need to be addressed as part of the health diplomacy, is one, the supply of the protective gear, but also the disposal, considering some of them are made of non-biodegradable material. Thank you so much, Dr. Wala. We appreciate your time, and we thank you for having made the time to join this conversation today. And we will, any questions for Dr. Wala that haven't been mentioned, they're going to be directed to her, and she will get a response to you through the university channel. I'm going to invite, thank you, Dr. Wala, we appreciate it. I'm going to invite Hazel Birungi, who's our final speaker for today. Hazel is going to take about 3 minutes to share her thoughts on this very important topic. Again, health diplomacy and the fight against COVID-19. Once Hazel is done, we're going to open up the room to questions. I've got quite a number of questions that have come through already. I'll be reading them. Some of them are duplicated, so I can bunch some of them together in the interest of time. And if there's any questions that we will not have the time to cover, the university is going to channel those directly to each of the individual speakers, and you will get a response from them. For those who've just joined us, we're talking about the fight against COVID, the context of Africa, and looking specifically at Kenya. So Hazel Birungi, please welcome to the mic, and we're looking forward to your insights.
Thank you, Noreen, for having me. From the conversation that is happening, it's quite clear that countries are now moving towards a global solidarity approach because they're dealing with a global pandemic. And another thing that we need to take into consideration is the fact that it's not just interstate relations that we're talking about here, because we have seen multilateral, organizations coming in. We're looking at large private philanthropies. So for me, this topic is quite important, and it is clear that this is a gray area, especially for Africa, especially for East Africa. This is because our foreign policy has not put health at the front lines. So what we are seeing here is that health diplomacy comes in to manage these relations between countries and countries, between countries and donor agencies, between countries and multinational enterprises, but also between countries and private philanthropists. And so it is important to have, or there is a need for, a central instrument to regulate how all these relations are going to take place. So regulation of exchange of goods, people, information, and services. We are seeing, for example, in Europe, how Germany is offering help to, Italy, and how Germany is offering help to Italy and France. And we're seeing that this is some of the things that Africa can take on as a whole. And also because of the data surveillance. So there is need for instruments, there is need for legal instruments to regulate how all this is going to go through. And that is why health diplomacy is important. I'll also agree with Dr. Mwala, I think, when she talked about who is at the table, who is negotiating these policies, who has the power, to determine what is going to be taken as priority or not. Do we have all these sectors that are being affected at the table, making input and coming up with ways forward on how best the country can proceed globally, but also taking into consideration the fact that a lot of money is going to be used, one, to manage the situation, but also in production of the vaccine. So an instrument, a legal instrument or legal infrastructure to regulate, one, who has access to the vaccine, how much we're paying for it, and to also avoid the vaccine being sold to the highest bidder. And also lastly, the fiscal implications of COVID. We are seeing many donations, but also loans that are being given to especially developing countries. Yesterday, the International Monetary Fund just approved a loan to my country, that is Uganda. And so because we are operating in this gray area and we do not have the instruments to regulate and to see how these relations will be determined, it provides for us an opportunity to tackle all these issues that are coming up, but also having in mind that there will be consequences. There will be consequences from the loans that we are getting. There will be consequences from the nations that we are getting. So all this is it's an interesting time and an opportunity for our countries to come together to think through a solidarity or one response in order to curb this, because we see that if one country or if two countries, for example, in East Africa, if 3 countries are implementing measures to prevent and another one is not doing that, all the efforts being done by all these others will be rendered futile. Yes, thank you, Noreen.
Hazel, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. You brought up a very important topic, especially around debt and the loans being given. I think it's happening globally at the moment. There is stimulus packages that are being given, but the public is not being educated on the consequences of taking these loans. And the governments of Africa are also going to have to pay them back in addition to the loans that we already have. So thank you for that thought. Thank you to all the speakers. I'm going to open the floor now. Quite a number of questions have come through. We're going to do our best to fit it in as much as possible. People have got very interesting questions to ask. It's now 11:21. We aim to wrap up by 12 noon because everybody's got things to do. So we're going to rush through the questions. There's questions for each of the speakers. The questions to Dr. Wala have already been posed, and she's gone on to her next engagement. But there's questions for Dr. Peter Muencha, Joyce Kibbett, Joel, and Hazel. And I'm going to jump between the different speakers and just to make sure that we get as much insights from them as possible. So just going back to you, Dr. Muencha, there's a couple of, actually 4 questions that have come through for you. I'm going to read 2 and you can share your thoughts with us on them. The first question asks, are there any safeguards at an international level to ensure that countries like the States do not hoard testing materials? That's the first question. And the next question is about Tanzania and Belarus. For countries like these that do not seem to be taking the pandemic as seriously as the rest of the world, do we anticipate to see any forms of sanctions against them? Actually, I'll also read the third question so you can answer them together. Would it be important for WHO to revisit the international health agreements at this point? Dr. Muencha.
Thank you for the questions, Noreen. Those are very interesting questions because if you look at what's happening at the moment, we do have what we'd call a global health architecture, which is underpinned by the WHO and international agreements around how to, including a protocol by the WHO on how to fight epidemics and pandemics. So the details of, I don't have all the details of what would be involved, let's say, in case you want to, say, give put in place sanctions against a country or even an institution. But what I can say is that many of these agreements only work when there's commitment, when there's reciprocity and commitment. And what you're seeing now is that COVID has more or less rendered some of these international agreements, I wouldn't say redundant, but countries are behaving as if some of these agreements are not important. And you can see some of the unilateral actions that the US has been taking, and India has also been trying to, impose restrictions on what kind of medication or exporting of medications, and other countries such as China also have, literally stopped, or rather, when the epidemic was at its height or at its peak, China imposed restrictions on what can be sold, particularly when it comes to personal protective equipment and masks. So I don't want to say that there's what you call there's a clear case of where a country can go and say impose sanctions, because how would these sanctions be imposed, and what route would that, what avenue would that be? Another issue is, touching on that, you've seen the issue around countries wanting reparations or damages from China for accusing them of being the source of the disease or not disclosing early enough when there was a problem around this. So there's a lot of controversy around here, and I think since this is the first really global pandemic in our age, and it's testing the international framework, and that's why these diplomacy issues have come to the fore, and we need to be very careful before we decide and say, we want this country to be sanctioned or not. So that's what I can say for now. There's still so much happening, and I think we will be quick to jump and make conclusions or accuse one country of this or another. When it comes to Tanzania, again, a very sensitive issue, because, like I said, there's issues here of sovereignty. There's national sovereignty issues. There's a way Tanzania would claim sovereignty on how it wants to approach these issues. But then again, when it comes to pandemics, as I mentioned during my presentation, we have shared sovereignty. If something happens in Tanzania, then it has an implication of Kenya, in extensions, could be affected by that. And let's not forget, one of the challenges with pandemics is the issue around what we call management of externalities, where actions in one country can affect another. And this is very sensitive, and this is the biggest problem when it comes to pandemics, whereby the question is, do you close borders? If you close borders, then what does it mean? If you don't share information, what does it mean? Or if you're seen not to have the capacity to fight a disease, should then other countries come in and offer help? And what if a country refuses to ask for help? Let's say you have countries like North Korea, which are difficult to engage international. You've got Eritrea here, our neighbor. You saw what was happening with Ethiopians living in Eritrea the other day. So these issues are very complicated, and that's where diplomacy, you need diplomatic frameworks or diplomatic relations in place so that you can able to engage even when you have such challenges. This is where now we need a robust global health discussion, and I think this is why this debate is very timely. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muencha. There's another question, but I'll come back to it if we have some time. I want to go to Joyce. Joyce, a number of questions have come through for you. I'm going to share with you all of them so you can answer them all in one go. And then I'll go to Joel, who's got also a couple of questions come through. So Joyce, one of the comments that came through is, yesterday the Health CS of Kenya announced a lockdown of Isili. For those of you who are not based in Kenya, based in other African countries, Isili is a community. It's an area in Nairobi where a large community lives. And this question says, yesterday the CS announced a lockdown of Isili in Nairobi and Old Town Mombasa. My question is, the Kenyan government acting within the law to enforce forceful mass testing of COVID-19, especially in Old Town Mombasa, without proper awareness? I think it didn't come through quite clearly, the question. But then I think the question is alluding to mass testing without raising proper awareness in these communities. Maybe that's raising some concern. The second question is actually this with regard to the speech that you read out. A couple of requests have come through, so I think we'll channel that through the admin of the university to share your speech with those who are interested. And the other question is, how can we increase massive testing in cases of the current state of lockdown? And the final question for you, Joyce, what do you reckon are some of the key FP issues? I'm not sure what they meant by FP. What are some of the key issues that should seriously be considered in order to help the already marginalized women-led enterprises in cross-border trade? So Joyce, those are your questions. If you want me to repeat any, please let me know.
Okay, thank you, Noreen. Can you hear me on your end?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I think I'll start with the last one. FP is foreign policy. Allow me to assume that. And the issues of women-led businesses in the context of health diplomacy will have to fall. First and foremost, the issues of women-led businesses, cross-border trade will have to fall under the economic diplomacy pillar, which our country does have. And I believe we have a very strong economic diplomacy department in the government. With a bot wrong, I think it sits in the Ministry of Trade. So cross-border businesses have been renegotiated under the different trade agreements in East Africa community or under the African context or various other trade agreements that we have with different nations. Now, these trade agreements, of course, the women-led businesses that are doing cross-border trade fall under these trade agreements. My assumption is that because of the presenting trade challenges that have come up that are national and that are national or regional, our economic diplomacy department in the country will have to relook and reinvent their policies to suit the different challenges. Now, our hope is that they will include the special nuances that women-led businesses face when they're doing cross-border trade, and there's a lot of research that informs them and informs the economic diplomacy practitioners that sit in our various tables. A lot of research that shows that women-led businesses that do cross-border trade face unique nuances. So some of the trade, if I was asked and I was put at the table, I would ask them to first and foremost quantify what the health safety measures will be necessary. That is a non-negotiable, that is a necessary variable that we will need to include in women-led businesses or any other cross-border trade or even national trade between one county to another. So first and foremost, let's recognize that health safety policies and health safety measures will be necessary daily life for the rest of the very many years, just like we have anti-terrorism security measures when you're doing trade, which were not there before 9/11. So if I was asked, I would it's very hard right now to speak specifics of what women-led businesses, foreign policy women-led businesses, foreign policy for women-led businesses would be. But it's very important that whatever health safety measures are put in place and are developed into foreign policy are looked at not constraining the financial measures for women because they're already marginalized, especially the financial constraint for women and also the movement of cross-border businesses for women. Those two will have to be looked at quantitatively and qualitatively. The other question will be, the government has, yes, put down a lockdown on Eastleigh and Old Town. I think we'd be making an assumption that proper awareness was not done. And because when you talk to many social psychologists, they say when there's a pandemic, the usual value chain, if I was to say, of social awareness does not apply because there are very many rapid conditions that are developing, and the government first priority is to save lives and to save massive lives, not just one or two or three. So I believe that proper awareness has to be done simultaneously with the lockdowns. And increase of massive testing when there's a lockdown, again, it will have to be multiple players informing the government. That's a very unique problem. I can't say I have an answer to, but we will have to psychologically budget that increase in massive testing is necessary, and that should be scheduled, especially with the lockdown. It will not be an open feel that let's all go for testing. It should be scheduled consequently for each and every community. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for sharing those thoughts. There is some other questions. I'll come back to them. Joel, we want to get your thoughts on a couple of questions that came up for you. The first question was, how effective is a free continental trade agreement in light of the current lockdown? And also the issue of security. I know it's been covered by different speakers, but the issue of security has come up. And what are your thoughts around security concerns where health diplomacy comes up, where countries are assisting other countries? Does that pose a major issue? I'll also pose that last question on security to Joyce once Joel has answered, has shared his thoughts on it.
To be honest, we haven't seen a statement by the Free Continental Trade Agreement on their way forward on this. So I wouldn't want to attempt to represent the African Union in this forum. However, we can conceptualize that it falls under the same fate as the other ambitious initiatives by the African Union, including the Silencing the Guns initiative, which was an initiative to end all violent conflicts in Africa by the year 2020. At this point, again, those are things that probably need to be relooked at, but theory guides us in a way that there was already the foreseeable future where government, NGOs, private capital will come together and work on serious security challenges, and I think the time is now. So the same fate that falls the Silencing the Guns initiative falls the Free Continental Agreement, that there needs to be a holistic, comprehensive approach, multi-sectoral discussions on the way forward, which up to this point, I believe that efforts are ongoing across board. On the issue of particularly the security, we also see that the other element that's been caused by this, the global pandemic, is a humanitarian crisis. So we're looking then at the migrants, the refugees that Africa has been hosting, what is happening to them at this point. We're at this place where an individual today is a source of international security, a threat to international security, which has not been the case for a while. So I think all security organs through now the technology that is being employed in terms of surveillance and tracking are currently doing their best. I don't think we are yet at the optimum level on any of these issues, but at least we're seeing positive efforts going forward to secure at least what we have managed to get.
Thank you, Joel. Joyce, I'll just continuing on from what Joel has just shared just now. I want to pose the question on security. Do you think that in the rise of health diplomacy, can it be used as an opportunity for countries providing aid and relief in the form of a Trojan horse to infiltrate the security systems and intelligences of other countries?
Wow, that's a very wide question. Let me put a focus on this. When COVID-19 hit, when we announced patient 1 in Kenya, I want to believe that that was not the time that our country started preparing in all aspects in the most broad spectrum way, whether it's education, health, economy, national security, climate, all that had already been put in place, because we have a mature response system, or a maturing response system in our country. So I don't believe that the security gains that we have acquired in Kenya, or let me speak for Kenya, the security, because there's a lot of disparity in terms of security measures in different African countries. But I do not foresee that the security gains that we have acquired in Kenya will be shrunk or will be lost as we fight the COVID-19 pandemic, because we have already instituted a multilateral team in terms of responding to the pandemic. We're not just looking at the health factor, but also in the security factor. That also says that even the philanthropic cash funds, I'm sure they're looking into money laundering. I'm sure they're looking into why does person A want to play a role in our country's fight against COVID-19, or even internal philanthropies, national philanthropies were Kenya. So I think we can move ahead knowing that our country has a multilateral group looking into this, including the security bodies.
Brilliant. Thank you. I think that's all in the context of Kenya. That's amazing. I know there's other countries that have this concern as well. So it's an interesting conversation around security. Hazel, there's a couple of questions that I wanted to focus on you for now. One of the questions that came up is the laws of compulsory masking are interesting, like in Uganda. I think we have listeners are calling in from Uganda. Such laws are already coming through, but do we have, or can we have, some standardized medical guidance on what we should do with these masks when speaking, when singing, like in choirs or musical shows? Again, in Uganda, Uganda has communities whose women's veils should, who wear veils, she meant to say, should these also use masks under or on top of their veils? That's the first question. The second question is, what is your comment on African countries adopting tough lockdown measures, reducing while there are still unending human needs such as foodstuffs, but with social welfare funding, but without social welfare funding streams? And the third question, which I think hasn't been brought up by any of the speakers as yet, but it's very important, is the issue of gender-based violence on the rise at the moment. It's global, but we're focusing on Africa. What is your take on how Africa should really address the rise of gender-based violence in this season of COVID-19?
All right. Thank you, Noreen. So starting with the issue of masks, the Ministry of Health in Uganda has actually issued guidelines on how to use the masks, but the focus has been so much on prevention that there has not been enough sensitization on what kind of masks should be used, how they should be used, and all that. So you'd see that there is a gap there, and a point that the ministries of health everywhere should or can take on in terms of sensitization on which kind of mask to use, how to use it, when to dispose of it, and how to dispose of it. In terms of responses, so lockdown and welfare, I know in my country that whenever the president has his presidential speeches, things like social welfare seem secondary to him. But we have seen that there have been very many calls, especially from civil society, to have budget realignment, to have money reallocated to not only cushion the economy, but to also cater for the social welfare of people. We've seen some countries have started giving relief in terms of food, but also there are underlying issues that come up because of that. So we're looking at the quality, who is giving out this food, who is having access to this food, and what's the quality of the food being given out. Another issue here would be really accountability. I would tell you, for example, in Uganda, when the president is ending his speeches, there is a long list of people who have donated not only money, but also food. And what we are not seeing here is accountability on how these funds are being allocated and how this food is actually being given out, because we have cases of frontliners who are not being paid enough, who are not getting access to all these things that are coming in order to help fight or give relief. So gender-based violence has been on the rise because we have people on lockdown, people contained at home. In Uganda recently, actually, the deputy police speaker mentioned that the cases had actually shot up. And what the call here is, one, taking this issue to be serious and not just left to the private, because whenever this issue comes up, it is declared to be a private issue. You'd find that many politicians, many legislators the response is, oh no, it's a family affair, deal with it. But that it is not a family affair, yeah? It is an emergency. We have laws in place. For example, in Uganda, we have laws pertaining domestic violence. But when we look at the response from police, response from the first people you'd go to, for example, the local councils here, you'd find that the response is, this is a private issue, don't come to us, go deal with it. So addressing one, the responses, also implementing these laws, but also massive sensitization and acknowledging that domestic violence is not a private issue. It is a public issue, and perpetrators must be brought to dot. They must face the law, face the consequences, and yeah, women should be protected.
Thank you very much, Hazel, for sharing those insights with us. I'm going to come back to Dr. Muencha. There's an important question that came up. What can we do to convince African players, such as the speakers on this webinar, to take part in building solutions for Africa with the African diaspora and taking a lead in building Africa's solutions? So I think this question is looking at connecting the diaspora with Africa to build solutions that are context specific and economically and also health-wise. And what can we do globally to support small solution providers in Africa when diplomacy fails local citizens?
Thank you for the question. Just to specifically address that question, I think what COVID has shown is that African countries need to take greater ownership of their health systems, because if you look at the budgets and healthcare budgets in African countries, there's a big chunk or a big significant amount of money or resources that are provided by international partners and donors. And therefore, you can understand that when somebody is giving you, or the ways funding or donations are made, they seek to empower entities that are associated with the donors or with the partners. So African countries need to invest in their healthcare system, take greater ownership, and in this way, then they will be able to support their own, and you can see now, because of the what we're talking about, the restrictions in international trade, countries are now being forced to manufacture their own masks, personal protective equipment, including even machines for breathing. So this is something that is now being addressed, and I think you can't give a blanket solution to all countries. It's all based on the specific needs, but priority means taking ownership and in putting more resources into healthcare systems. Yeah. So if I can just mention as another thing I can mention is that these challenges, the COVID-related challenges in the healthcare system and generally in the economy, are providing an opportunity for local industry to take up the needs, serve the needs that are there, the medical needs, but also also become competitive, internationally competitive. There's a lot of talk about inward-looking solutions, and COVID is now, providing the spark or the momentum for countries now to look inwardly and say, what can we do? How can we provide this? Who can provide this? what does it cost? And this is something that is very interesting, and it's an exciting development, especially for those people who have been looking for local solutions towards to certain sectors. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. No, that's brilliant. And in addition to what you just shared, Dr. Muencha, there's a question that I'd like to pose to, and any of the panelists can take it. I'll pose it to Joel, and this is around like just Dr. Misiani has shared, is the rise in local solutions. So we've seen Senegal has created a $1 test kit that is solving their own problems, and we want to see if this is going to spread across the continent, if other countries in Africa are going to reach out. We've also seen Madagascar has created its own cure of COVID using local herbs. And the Equatorial Guinea has purchased this product, and their recovery rates have shot up because of this solution. So what is your take on, like Dr. Muencha mentioned, local solutions that are being created, innovations that are on the rise, protective gear that's being created, and Africa trading, opening up and trading and sharing their own solutions as opposed to getting support from, say, Asia and the Western world, for example?
Okay, thank you. If I might just pick up from where Dr. left, which was on the issue of diaspora. I have happened to share a conversation with the chairperson of the Kenya Diaspora Alliance, that's Dr. Shemo Chwodo, and integrated them into the national efforts that are currently ongoing. And so the meeting will be happening tomorrow. And thereafter, perhaps from next week, there'll be a clearer role in terms of the engagements of the Kenya Diaspora Alliance with the national efforts going on. However, there's some particular advantages that the diaspora community has. For instance, that majority of the Kenyans abroad are in the health sector. So whether this is as nurses or medics in the US, in London, majority of Kenyans outside of the continent are in the health sector. So this is a very good advantage that we already have. And there have been many efforts that the diaspora community has been doing, including trying to support the women in business who are making the domestic masks and the African masks to ship them abroad. So through provisions of logistics for transport and the business of that nature. A lot of equipment has come from the Kenya diaspora into the country to help with the response. So this is something that's ongoing. It can be revitalized, it can be improved, but I must report that it's something that's already happening. Local solutions as well as things that are currently ongoing. We're launching crowdfunding. I think before even I speak about it, the government launched the M-Pesa, and we've seen 1.3 billion from ordinary Kenyans go into that account. And so, of course, Kenyans want to feel they're part of the solutions, and that's a very good place to start. We're now launching the crowdfunding for Kenyans in diaspora, again, for people to individually contribute to these efforts in whatever way they can. So these are efforts that are ongoing. However, at a continental level, we fall short of the systemic dependency on the West and donations, as has been envisaged with the World Banks. Today, there was, I think the IMF gave about over 700, $800 million to the Kenyan government, and about $400, $500 million to Uganda for this response. Well, of course, the scales are tilted in the sense of where the money is. However, like you said, the local innovations support this. We've seen in Kitui the productions of the mask. However, I think we must then look at it in the sense of a medium and long-term approach as well. So in terms of how much are we investing our own money into research towards a vaccine? Like you said, there was an attempt, not really an attempt, an effort by Madagascar, I think, to support it. So we don't know whether the Kenyan government has accepted this. We don't know to what level. I think we need a report in terms of whether the Kenyan government has received this preventive medicine and whether they're looking into mass distribution of the same. So these are conversations that up to this point, nothing has been reported. But I must say, also in terms of communication, which is also a very big problem right now, we face a missed opportunity if we don't really look at the issue of messaging that's going on around social media, which could make this another, like right now, we're already seeing cases of mental health issues just because of the communication going around during this time. And many people are trying to spread positive messages across their networks, and this is what should be there. Like we should have centralized communication, especially this time, to avoid what could be termed as an infodemic, which could come out of this pandemic. So I think at an individual level, we can make that contribution, just make sure that we're spreading the right messages that have a lot of positivity and not fear or rumor mongering, which could make the situation worse depending on who is the recipient of it. At a collective level, efforts are ongoing. Can more be done? Yes. We're looking into more partnerships. And so this is something that is currently ongoing, but we're not badly off again. We're in the right direction. We should pat ourselves. This is about 50 days from when this was declared a pandemic. So of course we should expect more of ourselves, but we should also appreciate the background that we're coming from in addressing such issues within the structures that we have.
Thank you so much.
Comment?
Absolutely, Joyce, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you for that overview. I just wanted to tag on the proposed Madagascar COVID-19 organic, as it's been called, organics. This is very key and it's very important, especially because of what we've said about the information that is going around that is very important in the fight against COVID-19. And it will also influence the diplomacy aspects of each nation. In 2001, what most of us may not be aware is that AU had already declared a decade of Africa Decade of Traditional Medicine. And what happened is that the West African countries got together and started interrogating this issue. And there's a very active institute for studying traditional medicine that was instituted. Now, this is in an effort to standardize traditional medicine, which is a nuance of the African continent, so that we also don't lose this heritage knowledge. So what has happened to the Mauritius cure? We cannot, none of the countries in the globe can deny or accept that it's a cure to COVID-19. Reason being that there's no system that had been put in place by the Mauritius scientific body that is peer-reviewed with regards to its cure. So Africa CDC has already asked for the scientific data to study this. And what we need to be careful as Africa moving forward is so that we don't lose out the what can I say, the local solutions that we're coming up with that will be massive, not just in cures, but many other solutions, financial solutions, social solutions, is to try and adopt systemization in our African inventions and innovations, which is very deficient in the African context. And sometimes we get lost in the noise and in the traditional informal aspect of launching innovations. So my take on this would be for the listeners and the stakeholders in this conversation to not yet call it a cure and not to discredit it and say it's not yet a cure, but to try and take a middle ground and wait for the Africa CDC and the other stakeholders to give a scientific peer review to it. To accept or to deny this as a cure. And the good thing is that we're not going to throw the baby out with the bathwater and say it's not a cure. But it also shows how important the diplomatic aspect and protocols are, because this is purely my opinion. I think Mauritius lost the possibility of the scientific community interrogating this by not going through protocol and not going through the diplomatic aspect of suggesting the innovation to the public world, so to the scientific world and to the biomedical field. So systemizing our innovations and our internal solutions, broad spectrum, will be so key, so that Africa is no longer seen to be the informal continent, but we'll be able to even export our systems, our IP, our trademarks to other countries. And I believe we already have the diaspora connections. We already have indigenous minds that are extremely sharp. We have AI that we're working with, that will enable us to come up with inventions and innovations. But systemizing Africans' innovations and inventions will be a very key undergird moving forward. Yeah.
Thank you, Joyce. I think the key word there is systemizing. Africa's biggest downfall is systems, data collation, and using that data to drive decision making, to drive policy. Thank you for sharing that. One of the key things that has come up, and another question has come up, is we've talked about the Kenyan diaspora, but is there a possibility of extending that from just making it a Kenyan diaspora, making the East African diaspora? I'll make that a rhetoric question. I think, Joel, that question falls right on